My name is Marci, and I'm a survivor of postpartum depression. I feel like if I can survive the ordeal that I went through, anyone else can. I'm not saying that mine is the most extreme that's ever been documented in the history of the world. I'm just saying that I'm a wuss, and it was the hardest thing I've ever had to go through in my entire life. I've been treated for anxiety and depression my whole life. And I was being treated while I was pregnant with my daughter. And when I gave birth to her almost 7 years ago, it was actually a very traumatizing labor and delivery. I feel like the doctors and the hospital staff neglected me, and I was put through hours and hours and hours of unnecessary pain. And after all that, I actually didn't want to see my daughter for a while. And then coming home from the hospital and having the pressure and the stress of being a new mom on top of that trauma I had just experienced and my history with anxiety and depression, it was just a perfect recipe to send me into a downward spiral. And it took a couple of weeks before we realized that I was not going to come out of this just by having a good attitude. My husband took me to the hospital, and the staff wouldn't let me go home. They were afraid that I would harm myself. So I was admitted to the psychiatric unit, which I love to refer to as the nut hut because got to keep a sense of humor. And I was there for a week. I had doctors and therapists watching me 24/7, and they played with my medications a little bit. And by some miracle, I was feeling so much better in a week. I was able to come home, and while things were not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, I was functioning and I was able to enjoy being a new mom. So over the course of the next 3 years, I had a psychiatrist that I saw quite regularly. And then I got pregnant with my son, and I made a pretty good plan of action with my husband. We knew what to do if things started to get bad again after I gave birth. We knew what signs to look for. My psychiatrist told me that he would be available to me as often as he could be to help adjust things if I started to feel bad again. And I thought I was out of the woods because I had my son, and I think I was just completely euphoric for the first week or two. I was so in love with that little guy. He was so sweet. And then, unfortunately, things got bad again. And we had this plan of action, and we had so many routes that we could take no matter what was thrown at us. But unfortunately, nothing could have possibly prepared us for the massive storm that was headed our way. I saw my psychiatrist very, very often for about 3 months. He tried me on multiple new medications, and unfortunately, with each new attempt to get me to feel better, the medications would wear off after maybe 3 days. So we got a little bit desperate. My husband realized that the best thing we could do at that point was to take me to the hospital again. And unfortunately, the facility he wanted to take me to didn't have any room available. So he took me to a different facility that had a room. And unfortunately, I might have been better off if I had just stayed home and waited. But he took me there, and it was a terrible, terrible experience. They misdiagnosed me with bipolar depression, and they sent me home on medications I shouldn't have been on. I came home a zombie. I don't really remember too much about the whole situation. And it wasn't much long after until those medications stopped working for me. And again, I was back where I started, only this time it seemed much worse. And this whole time I had been praying. I had been begging and pleading and praying as earnestly as I possibly could have that this would all just be taken away from me, that we would find a solution. And every time I thought things were getting good enough to where my prayers had been answered, they just got bad again and again. And I was so frustrated at that point. I thought, we're never going to find a solution. So I prayed harder and I felt worse. And so I prayed even harder than that, and I felt worse than that. And it just kept going like that until all of a sudden the only way I can describe it is it was this thick, dark, suffocating black cloud that just filled my mind, and it was like a poison, and it carried into me physically, where I felt like I was in so much pain that I thought the pain of the anxiety, the pain of the depression, this not being able to breathe so much, I thought it was going to kill me before I would even have a chance to hurt myself or kill myself. And it got so extreme again that my husband, he didn't even wait for someone to tell him if there was an opening. He took me to the hospital that we should have gone to the first time. And luckily, by some miracle, there was an opening. And I was there back in the nut hut for 2 whole weeks. And it was during that time, my first night or two, I realized that God wasn't ignoring my prayers. His answer to me was that he put brilliant minds and doctors and all kinds of professionals on this earth to help in these specific situations. And I was so fortunate to be put in the hospital that I was, because the most brilliant, genius mind was there right with me, and he knew exactly what to do. He suggested to me that I get Electroconvulsive Therapy, or ECT, and I wasn't too afraid of that suggestion. He said that most people get nervous because it sounds like such a barbaric treatment, but at that point, nothing could have possibly been any worse than what I was dealing with. So that's what I did. I had ECT every other day, and it was terrible. It hurt my head. I was confused constantly. I couldn't complete very simple sentences. Things that I had learned long ago, I forgot, and I would forget almost instantly something maybe I had just eaten. But as time went on, I felt better, and after those 2 weeks of being in the hospital, I was able to go home and continue outpatient treatment. And it got to a point where my doctor said, I think we're good. I think, we're gonna carry on, try just the medications and see how it goes. And it wasn't too long after that I started to feel bad again. So I went back to him and I said, I feel like it's not working. It didn't do what it needed to do. And he said that unfortunately there's no perfect science to it, that we just have to keep going until we finally hit that reset button that needed to go off in my brain to start responding to medications again. With the huge hormonal change that I had just gone through and giving birth, my brain became completely resistant to all medications, and it had gone so haywire. And I kept going. I kept getting more treatments, and the more treatments I got, the more I forgot everything. Unfortunately, looking back, I don't remember the first 6 months of my son's life, but luckily I wrote down as much as I could, and I have people telling me what it was like, and it didn't sound like it was all terrible, but finally that one last final ECT treatment came, and that combined with about 10 different medications, I was able to carry on and I was able to function again. And I don't understand how that brilliant man I was so fortunate to be right in the same city as him, right in the same vicinity where he had just studied this his whole life, and he knew exactly what to do. I would tell him how I felt and when I felt it and how often I felt it, and he would just, without hesitation, know exactly what to do. And we became connected somehow, and he really looked after me almost like I was his sister maybe, and he made sure to get me into see his prodigy that he had been with during her fellowship of being a psychiatrist, and he really made sure I got the best of the best, and I have, and I've seen her very regularly for the last almost 4 years. And things have, again, not been perfect, but they've been so much better. Anytime I've ever had a trial in my life, I will look back and think, there was something I had to learn there. There was something that I'm supposed to understand because of that very difficult trial I went through. And after all of that, I had no idea why I went through all of that, and I have no idea what I learned through all of that. I think it took me a while before I realized that people just need to hear the story. People need to know how terrible things can get, and that even at the very worst times, there's always a solution. And you have to keep looking for it. And sometimes it takes 6 months until you feel better. But I will say that there's always hope. There's always someone to turn to. There's always someone who understands. And for the people who don't know what it's like, they need to be the ones to suck it up and to have faith in the person who is trying to explain to them what it's like to be a mom suffering with postpartum depression. And I wouldn't wish that experience on my worst enemy, but just remember there's hope, and things are always so much better after you've made it through that. Refiner's fire. You come out so much stronger than you ever were before.